Okay, so welcome everybody to this very special joint recording, which is both for the Folklore podcast, my own project, and also for the Archaeological Fantasies Archie Gaming Con thing that they're organising. It's got a name. It keeps changing every time I look at the Discord, and obviously we're recording this in advance. So Archeo Gaming Con, organised by Archaeological Fantasies and the Folklore podcast, joint recording of this interview to talk about folklore and archaeology in gaming. And that could be any type of gaming depending on your particular desires, but particularly with the people that I have in front of me on my screen here today, this is talking about role-playing games and similar sorts of things. So we have here, well, I'll let you introduce yourselves. Let's start top left on my screen, Mr. Tom, who is over in Germany. Who are you and what are you doing with all this stuff?
Hi. Yeah, I'm over in Germany. You might hear this from my accent. And I'm running RPGs for I don't know, close to 20 years by now. Primarily as the storyteller or GM. And I specialized in the realm of the fairies and the changelings and right now folklore.
Thank you. And down at the bottom of my screen, the gentleman gamer, Mr. Matthew Dawkins. Would you like to say a little about yourself?
Hello, yeah, definitely. So my name is Matthew Dawkins. I am a long-time role player, and also a creator of role-playing games. I write and develop them for various companies, mostly for Onyx Path Publishing, though I've worked for Chaosium, White Wolf, Green Ronin, and a bunch of others too. And yeah, my go-to genre is horror. Especially, I take a lot of enjoyment out of the folk horror, which is why I'm here, when we've got a historic basis for what we're doing. So yeah, delighted to be here.
Thank you both for taking the time. Folklore is, in essence, in many ways, I guess, about storytelling, isn't it? When you look at the early transmission of folklore, then it was very much oral transmission. It was stories around the campfire. It was how beliefs were passed on, but it was also how people learned and how traditions and superstitions passed down as well. And I think probably for me, a good role-playing game is one that doesn't worry so much about the mechanics, but focuses more on that storytelling aspect. Do you think that makes a strong game?
Well, I'll chime in immediately. So that's an interesting question because you're, of course, going to get different views depending on the type of role player, none of which are wrong or right. But I think when it comes down to taste, speaking of myself, yes, I prefer a game with a rich setting, with a lot of story hooks that the storyteller, director, GM can pull on, and hopefully the players can as well. Because it provides a certain sense of immersion for the people participating in the story in the game, whereas mechanics often can get in the way of said immersion if a game is too mechanically heavy. Now, there are lots of games available now where the mechanics are, I guess, developed in simpatico with the settings, so that using the mechanics is a way of evoking parts of the setting, of the mood, so that when you're rolling dice, it doesn't feel like you're being pulled out of the game, but almost being drawn more deeply inside it. So there are certainly plenty of games where it does work. But I think the traditional view of role-playing is that when it comes time to roll dice, everyone kind of stops what they're doing. They roll the dice, they start counting numbers, and then, I guess to use the Dungeons and Dragons example, because why not go there first, you then say how many hit points you've knocked off of a target, rather than you've brutally lost your arm in the tree that you were just plunging your fist into. That's more of a Flash Gordon thing than anything else, but it could happen in folklore too. So yeah, I completely see the point, but For me, setting is more important, but mechanics are by no means disposable.
Tom, you've run various campaigns of which I've taken part in a couple, and I've heard more through your work with Red Moon role playing and podcasts like that, for example. And I think you favour this approach too. Is that true to say?
Yes, very much. The dice rolls, I like to think of them as an action of engagement of the players. So we are telling the story all together. The storyteller traditionally has the bigger part in this process, and in some of the games I play, there is no dice rolls for the GM. There's only dice rolls for the players, and that's a good way to emphasize this is a very important engagement moment for the players. So they actively do something to change the flow of direction. And I think that's the best part, especially if it's only for a short duration. If you go into number crunching, then all of the immersion I build up, or we build up, is gone. And I strive for a very, very high immersion game.
It's interesting you point that out. I think there's an increasing tendency among games for these player-driven roles. Pretty much every game I'm writing for now, come to think of it, never has the GM rolling unless it's a game where the GM can control monsters or antagonists that deal damage. That tends to be the exception. But yeah, for the most part, it's rather than you trying to do a contested roll against the GM to see who does better, or the GM rolling to see whether his character can hypnotize you. You are just rolling to resist a static target. And it puts a hell of a lot more onus on the player, and therefore more narrative control over the player, because the result should be, even if you fail, you still have a story to tell off the back of it. And that's a massive sea change in role-playing, probably that's only really taken place over the last 5 years in a major way. That failure, in the sense of narrative failure, dice rolling failure, I'm trying to climb the wall, but I roll and I slip down the wall instead, and there's a werewolf right behind me, is actually there as a good thing. Failure, multiple failures lead to a grander success at the end, which in the traditional heroic narrative is pretty typical, but in the way role-playing games have historically been portrayed isn't the way you want to go. You just want to succeed. And if you fail, it's, damn, I failed. Now I'm going to be punished for it.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of narratives, as you say, the heroic storytelling narrative, for example, they come across very well into gaming from those more traditional type of stories. What is it about folklore themes, particularly, that makes them good for RPG settings? Tom?
I think they're, in preparation, I thought about what would I do in a traditional RPG which is not directed at folklore. And then there would be a story about a dark wizard in his tower, and he is summoning his undead minions and stuff like this. And this, how do the characters learn about this? They learn probably from the villagers, who might have noticed this or becoming a victim. But it's always some, you have the ordinary world and you have your heroes and they venture to adventure. But with folklore, which is in the middle of the everyman's life, you have a more intimate perspective of the game. And I think it's a more natural approach to storytelling, because the villagers won't get that that the dark wizard is a necromancer or stuff like this. They would have a broad idea, but it's over there. It's not comprehensible for them. If you engage with a creature of local myth, it's their story. And by this, you have scenery with NPCs who are involved in the conflict, in the story, and it's giving more color and more story to the place and the people you're playing with. And I don't think I answered your question.
It's perfectly good. It's perfectly good. Matthew, when you're designing games, if you're drawing on these kinds of themes, is it the mythical creatures that are a good aspect to this, or is it the underlying kind of themes of the storytelling that work well for you?
Well, so it depends entirely on the game, of course, and the gaming group. But to use a very popular folk horror movie, such as The Wicker Man, which pulls on everything from a homicidal paganism, which I think the most pointed part of interest in that movie is you don't know how long or if they have even practiced human sacrifice before the one in the movie, really. But there's certainly an air of sinister belief throughout it. Has everything from traditional horror suspense and shock with things like The Hand of Glory, with Edward Woodward's, I guess, almost gradual descent into paranoia, if not insanity. There's the erotic angle, of course, with Britt Ekland's body double dancing. And there's the human aspect as well through, he is there because he genuinely cares about the whereabouts of a missing child, or a child he believes is missing. Now, all of that is layered, and I think that really helps in a folklore RPG. You have to, or a folklore story in general, you need to look at it from pretty much the middle out at every moving piece on the board. Folklore is a fantastic element to have. I don't think it can necessarily sustain an entire campaign without these other elements to keep it moving, such as the raw horror, the shock element, the suspense, the thrills, and having interesting protagonists who Woodward isn't playing a particularly sympathetic character, but you become very conscious of his fate as you get near the end. You don't want him to fall into this horrible fate, despite the fact you know what's coming. And I think that is a really interesting part of a lot of folklore stories, and especially the way folklore is presented in RPGs. Characters aren't necessarily good guys. Often they are walking into places about which they know very little, and they make a lot of mistakes for which they end up being punished. And you kind of have to say, well, they walked into this, they should have educated themselves beforehand as they make mistake after mistake. But at the same time, do they deserve this? And when doing that in a role-playing game, there's a fine line between feeling punishing as a storyteller. You don't just want to make the players feel like there's no hope, and also keeping that horror element, the predestined element that is often present in folklore, present as well. It's a balancing act, in my opinion, keeping that strong monster and strong folklore setting and all the rest blended together.
And I think that's where something like the campaign that we played for Solemn Veil, for example, is actually really successful, and yet at the same time is not, by a lot of people's definition, a kind of fairly standard RPG, because it's not got, I think a lot of people, perhaps more, if they're more on the periphery of gaming, think of RPGs as being that kind of D&D element of there are fantastical creatures, and you might be one yourself, or you're an elf or a dwarf, and you're out to kind of destroy your way through all of this.
Whereas, kill monsters, take their gold. I would say, I'd hazard that even most Dungeons and Dragons groups have moved on from that somewhat, but it doesn't mean the perception isn't there.
Yeah.
And I think most people's first time games, if they're running a game for the first time, is going to be to look at the book and see what's most clear. And the clearest points in a game like D&D or a traditional game are, these are evil, you are good or neutral, therefore you're best off just wiping the evil out and taking what's theirs, maybe to give it back to the community, maybe to enrich yourself, but it's a very black and white view. Whereas, as you say, games like Solemn Veil, I would say even Call of Cthulhu has a certain nuance to it, but because the great old ones are cosmically evil, you still need to oppose them.
Yeah.
You're not going to succeed by sitting down and doing nothing.
Yeah, it's a that split between good and evil is an interesting one as well. Tom, you like Changeling the Lost is a favorite of yours, and one that you work with a lot, as you said earlier. And when we look at creatures such as the Fae, sometimes we can't even say for definite whether they're good or evil. People aren't sure in folklore sometimes whether the fairies are good or bad. And depending on where you are, perhaps in the world, they might be one thing or they might be another. And that adds an extra interesting element. What is it about that aspect of folklore, and in particular about running a campaign in a setting like Changeling, for example, that appeals to you?
I think we have to differentiate between editions. They shifted a little bit in second edition from fairies are a mythical force of nature, and by being these more or less godlike creatures who live from conflict, and they simply need engines for this conflict, so they take away mortals and reap them for their emotions and their stories. That's how they, or how I think they are working. And so you can't put them into an alignment other than they are themselves, and they only think about themselves. In second edition, it's a more psychological approach, and they are evil. They are horrible persons who go for the suffering, the true suffering of their victims, and they are vicious and very selfish. But they might act as if they are good, as if they are on the righteous side, and they will present themselves as the people who are looking out for the victims. They are gaslighting them, and they might appear to help you. They come to you in a vulnerable moment and offer you aid, and in return, because they're fairies, they own a debt of you, and that's probably you or your life or something else like this. And there are actually many stories about fairies who appear to be good-hearted, and they are in some sort of problem, and the protagonist will help them, rescue them from a dangerous situation, and the fairy will repay them with helping them in a workshop or keeping the house clean. And then there are some miraculous rules which will be broken in the further ongoings of the stories, and then the fairy has the right to punish the protagonist for his misdeeds. So they turn it around. They always turn it around to make it the fault of the mortal, and be horrible persons.
So that kind of unpredictability in the narrative, I guess, is something that makes it more of a. It's not a predictable game by its very nature, something like that, I suppose. And that's the thing with dealing with these kinds of supernatural or creatures from our superstitious beliefs, is that there is that unpredictability about them. Matthew, what have you worked on that is particularly strong for you as far as these kinds of creature-based games go? I mean, I suppose something like Vampire the Masquerade is very rich in its background that it can draw on from these kinds of things. But does that necessarily make it one of the better ones?
Well, I think there's a lot of people that do love Vampire and probably would consider it one of the best horror games. But I think by their ubiquity in Vampire the Masquerade, existing in pretty much every city you're going to visit, there will be vampires. They lose some of their allure in the sense of Changeling the Lost. The true Fae are terrifying as well because they are so, as you say, unpredictable, but they're also rare and godlike. And so you're not going to bump into an entire host of them by walking around the corner, whereas vampires, I wouldn't say they're 10 a penny, but in Masquerade, if you go to a nightclub in a World of Darkness city, there's likely going to be a vampire on the dance floor as well, running the club. Now, I would say on the vampire vein to go for a more, again, folkloric, historic look at them. There's a game called Dark Ages Vampire or Vampire the Dark Ages, depending on the edition. And the way that's set up, it's set in despite the name, it's set in the British Middle Ages, so around the 13th century. And the general, I guess, theme is that towns and villages are like beacons of flickering light, and the rest is darkness. Because there are no well-trod roads, really. There's no beacons lighting the way from one civilization to the other. And because you are vampires who can only travel at night, you are penned in to your little fiefdom, whether it is a village, a farm, a town, or, if you're fortunate enough, a city. But leaving those boundaries is what's terrifying, because even as monsters, you don't know what other monsters lurk out there. And so there's a nice inversion, because you are still monstrous, you're still predatory when it comes to mortals, but there's things out there that you don't want to confront. So again, you mentioned unpredictability. I think the Dark Ages, as it's called in Vampire, is a wonderful setting to be able to explore both history, and you can present history in historically accurate terms. There's a lot of very good books about Vampire, the Dark Ages set during the time of the Crusades. And it covers everywhere from the British Isles to Iberia to Jerusalem and Constantinople. And does so pretty damn well, but then it layers vampires into it to give it this monstrous mythological bent. You know, how would this be different if there were these human parasites riding the wave of crusading armies? And how would they try and influence things for their own gain? So yeah, I think Vampire certainly has a place for it. There's other monster games as well. We mentioned Call of Cthulhu earlier, and that's, of course, a classic role-playing game, but it's also a classic monster game, with the strange definition of being the game where you never want to meet the monster. I mean, there are other games that do that. It was probably the first to do it. I think the first time it was released was like 1981, which is pretty early in tabletop RPG canon. But the idea being that as investigators, you have to get as close to the monstrous truth as you possibly can without ever seeing or touching the monster. Because if you touch the monster, if you see the monster, you will either go mad or die. Now, that doesn't always happen. It's not every single story, but it's quite a lot of them, especially the early modules for Call of Cthulhu. and it adds that eerie, suspenseful nature that you want out of a story, while also, from a critic's point of view, being somewhat unsatisfying, because a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios play out the same way as a lot of horror movies do, where you know for a fact this group is going to get whittled down until by the end evil will triumph. That's especially common these days in horror movies, but Call of Cthulhu very much set the mold for that in terms of tabletop role-playing games.
I want to think a little bit about the representation of magic as well in games. When we think about magic in terms of folklore, then I think we're thinking about it in terms of superstition mostly, and probably looking at aspects such as historic witch trials and those sorts of things. Magic sits a little bit differently in terms of RPGs. How does magic work well as a mechanic, rather than being something that becomes too unbelievable? I think when we look at stories in folklore, there has to be a kind of believable element to it to make it work. How does magic fit into RPGs in terms of believability and not being something that becomes just way over the top?
So there's lots of different ways of tackling it, and I know it sounds like we're kind of hammering on D&D a bit, but it's a good example of classified magic systems, Vancian magic as it's called, where everything has a level, everything has a category, and you can pretty much just cast it from a book and boom, it's done. It's movie magic and video game magic, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessarily thematic. It doesn't feel special when you're firing off a magic missile every single round. It just loses some luster. One of the best, or a couple of the best uses of magic in role-playing games are in the mage games, Mage the Ascension and Mage the Awakening, for World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness. And one of the simplest ways that they are kept, I guess, in check is through a system called paradox. So it's especially prevalent in Mage the Ascension, where if you perform magic that could be determined vulgar, overly vulgar, in other words, if unawakened humans, sleepers as they're called, see this magic in practice, they will have no way of rationalizing it. Even the universe itself has no way of rationalizing Godzilla being dropped on a city, or just fireballs being shot from your hands in plain view in the middle of a football stadium. So paradox is like the universe course correcting, and you will be hit with a backlash for all the way up to essentially a black hole appearing and devouring you because you've just done something bad. And it means you are confined to playing out your magic in discrete ways, in ways that appear believable, whether it's through preparation, whether it's through obfuscation, or through things like ritual practice, or associating with other people that believe the same things you do. Because when you manage any of these, you can then use your magic in these subtle ways that allows you to change the universe, but only as far as people that can understand your magic understand it. And there's a similar thing going on in Mage the Awakening. They're very good. They're obviously games about playing mages, magic users, wizards. So it's built around that aspect. But other games go very much into the extreme version of that, where to use Call of Cthulhu again, why not? There's a lot of spells in that game that require hours or days of preparation before casting. So you are theoretically supposed to play your character going through the sacrifice that's required to make this incantation, covering himself in chalk dust, drinking the bile of his enemy, and painting a sigil on the floor and so on before he does that. And that makes it become part of the plot. But it's also quite paralyzing for the narrative because it's not really a communal activity. Well, I guess it can be, but it's one of those things that tends to not work terribly well from a narrative perspective. So, yeah, again, there's always a balance to be found, but it's something not too many games manage to get right, in my opinion.
Sometimes I like the idea as well of some of these creatures and events and things being on our periphery. And again, this is something we find when we look at different aspects of folklore is this idea of a liminal place, this kind of boundary state between one thing and another. I recently interviewed Johan Egerkrantz, who is the author of the book Wesen, which is a kind of bestiary of Scandinavian folkloric creatures and history. He's an illustrator by profession, so it's a beautifully illustrated book, but also very well researched. And that was picked up and turned into an RPG recently by Free League, and has just come off of Kickstarter and is going into more general release. And I think, having played that game, that it's hugely successful in the way that it works in this kind of boundary state, which very much draws from some of these Scandinavian folkloric creatures, in that we don't always know that just because they are a creature within the game, that means that they're going to be a hindrance. And sometimes dealing with these creatures is actually, you're dealing with people who are on your side as well as being against you. Most people, when they think of the term Wesen, think of the American drama series Grimm, which again works in a similar kind of way with these creatures that some people can see and are aware of, and other people can't. And for all its folkloric faults, if you like, Grimm was quite an entertaining series. But I think
I'd like to interrupt by saying I think Grimm is shite, but do carry.
It can be bad and entertaining at the same time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I'll take that. But where I think it is successful in terms of the RPG is this kind of element of not actually knowing what you're dealing with sometimes. And I think in terms of a narrative, that's really successful. Tom, you've run Wesen sessions. I've played your Wesen sessions, but you've run them for other people as well. Do you find that particularly good as an aspect to work with?
I love it. It's currently my second favorite game, and it's the whole adventure is built around the mystery of the creature, of the Wesen you will encounter, and you have to do a lot of research to find out what is this creature. Will it, even if it's, let's say it's a troll, will it be like the other troll we encountered a year ago? Probably not. It's a different troll. It has its own strength and own powers, and of course its own story, which is the most important part. So I can't rely on it's a troll, we have to bash his head in, because first, you probably can't bash his head in. That's one of the most important mechanics of the game. The Wesens are, in the end, immortal to violence. You have to figure out a ritual to appease them, to set them to rest, to imprison them, or to kill them. And that's a different part of the adventure. How, after I discovered what kind of creature is it, what story is behind it, how will I deal with it, and then in the end, do I want to deal with it, or do I want to deal with another threat which is also looming there? And that's the part I really love.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that does work really well. Matthew, have you come across the similar examples of these sorts of games where just because there is a creature in it, it doesn't necessarily follow that means that it is bad?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, any game worth its salt should have that. Again, if it just comes down to good versus evil, I think it's a little bland narratively. But hell, let's give D&D a shout out this time, because you pointed out, you might be playing elves and dwarves, and in some cultures, they are, especially Nordic ones, these can be magical and almost godlike and capricious creatures, but in D&D they're presented as quite playable. And in fact, there's very much a change on how people are viewing the I guess stereotypical orc in D&D right now. Within the last few weeks, to be honest, there's been a lot of noise online about should orcs always be categorically evil, and I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing discussing, because any staple of fiction like orcs, it's wonderful to see them being discussed, especially if new thought can be brought from it. But I think a lot of GMs have always been presenting things like orcs, goblins, kobolds, what have you, as creatures that aren't just there to hit over the head and steal their stuff. There should always be the moral quandary. There should always be the possibility that conflict will lead to discussion rather than destruction. And there should be the orcs who are just traders who you may want to talk to, who might give you advice because there's something far worse and more elemental in its evil just over the horizon. Whereas a culture may be evil from a human perspective, to use D&D terms, I guess, but it doesn't necessarily mean every single orc within that culture is representative of the worst aspects of that culture. Just the same as you could categorize any person on Earth as not being wholly representative of the nation, culture, religion, what have you, that they belong to. You can go further, and I mean, a bit of self-promotion. Right now I'm running a Kickstarter for my They Came From Beyond the Grave game. And They Came From Beyond the Grave is a game wholly based around 1970s horror movies. Hammer Horror, Amicus, Roger Corman, even. Anything where Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Patrick McGee, people like that, Michael Goff appear with a certain amount of regularity, and Ingrid Pitt, Britt Eklund. But one of the excellent things about movies of that era is that Dracula was never a voiceless monster. Dr. Frankenstein is never a voiceless monster. Like Karnstein is never voiceless. They have personalities. Sometimes they phone it in, but sometimes they're also portrayed as quite sympathetic. When you start looking into the brides of Dracula, they are sometimes victims. More often than not, they're victims of Dracula, and now they are trying to be redeemed, or they may no longer wish to be vampires, or they may be fully fledged servants of the Dark Lord, the Prince of Misrule, or what have you. So I think in They Came From Beyond the Grave, you've got the exact same thing. We want to portray our monsters as being nuanced. As much as it's a fun game with a tongue-in-cheek attitude at times, it's still a game where if you bump into Dracula, you should be able to have a conversation with him, you should be able to negotiate with him, and you should be able to get a head start before he comes chasing after you.
I'm going to pick up on that point about culture to just kind of also move this across into the archaeological side of the discussion as well, in that there is obviously a crossover between folklore and archaeology in many ways, but in terms of uncovering our past, they're both very, very relevant. Do you think there are any games that are particularly strong at representing our culture, such that when we move forward in history, we can look back on these games and say, yeah, actually, they show the culture in which they were developed?
That's a very good question, I think. Because I can definitely think of examples that are bad that you could look back on in 3 decades and think, oof, that was misjudged. But there's also some that are excellent resources that could double as historic textbooks, history textbooks, such as the Steve Jackson GURPS source books. GURPS is by no means, I guess it's de rigueur these days to refer to GURPS as a mechanically heavy, flavorless setting, but the whole point of GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, is it's all of the things that it says in the title. But what GURPS had for it, and still does, is an amazing array of source books written by experts on a whole ream of cultures. You've got everything from transhumanism to the Vikings. You've got the Celts, and you've got Florence. You've got Mars attacks, all the way through to what it's like to live in a Middle Ages village. And these books tend to be so flavorful and so well written that you can not just refer to them as eminently usable role-playing game resources in any game, whether you're using GURPS or not. They're also brilliant for history, and to look at them and think of, okay, so this is representative of the way experts thought at the time. Times may change, appraisals of certain periods may change, but GURPS presents a lot of very neat little time capsules that you can re-examine and still find use for, even if some of the content is problematic or outdated.
That's really interesting. Tom, is there anything for you that sits within this kind of historical setting very well?
Not primarily, but I had to think of Seventh Sea, which lends a lot from European history. And after reading about a specific culture from the Seventh Sea universe, I got really interested about Poland and Polish history, and I realized, wow, that fantasy story over there, it's not too different from what actually happened, and that was crazy. So I would say it's probably Seventh Sea for me.
That's interesting. That makes these games kind of multifaceted in another way as well, doesn't it? That they become a kind of springboard to being an educational resource as well in some cases. That desire to look into Polish history off the back of that game is a really good example. In terms of archaeology, I can think of obvious settings within other types of gaming. The archaeo gaming, in many ways, there are examples like Tomb Raider, to pick probably the most blatantly obvious one, where archaeology is very much represented. Is there anything within RPG settings in which we find it in the same way? Can we think of? I suppose Mummy, in some respects, kind of touches on that area.
What do you think, Tom? Have you got anything?
I do have. I thought about a German RPG called The Dark Eye in English. Redmond Role Playing did a series on that not too far long ago, and there's a campaign called the Phileason Saga, which is roughly about the story of making a a race around the world in 80 weeks. And on this trip, you will do quite a lot of archaeological work, like entering a grave, finding all the scriptures and pictures on the wall, finding the corpses and some relics from the former times, and you have to reconstruct what happened in this place from all of this. This was so the best example of archaeology work in RPG I found so far. And from there I went to probably dungeon delving in the most broad sense. If you are interested in the history of the place you're truly visiting, or it's just to go there to kill the Lich Lord, then you probably won't do a lot of research.
Oh, well, look, we can give D&D another shout out here, surely, can't we? Because what is a dungeon if it's not a piece of archaeology, surely?
Yeah, sometimes they're sewers, but even sewers and aqueducts are archaeological a lot of the time. So there are some interesting ones. You mentioned Mummy the Curse. Mummy is a fantastic series for looking back at one's history, especially as it has a certain time hopping nature to it, where your characters are amnesiac by default, and as they stay awake for longer, they regain memories of their past and the civilization from which they originate. But one that doesn't really get discussed as an archaeological game, but very much is Numenera by Monty Cook Games. Numenera could very well be seen as post-apocalyptic because it's called, I think, the ninth world. It's supposed to be the ninth great human civilization, and or global human civilization. And you have no idea really of what's happened to the prior 8, except that you live in the ruins of 8 civilizations or 8 epochs worth of humanity's wreckage. And rather than it being a game of picking through the ruins in a very bleak sense, like a lot of post-apocalyptic games are, it's more about reconstruction, delving into history to rediscover lost technologies, to analyzing the works of your distant ancestors to find out what your path might be. And it's probably the most optimistic post-apocalyptic game because it's all about exploration. It's all about finding abandoned cities, tombs, temples, and things that, from a medieval fantasy perspective, look positively futuristic. There's a science fiction element to it as well, because your civilization is very much in that medieval come Renaissance era, but some of the civilizations prior to yours reached far beyond where you are now, and you don't know what killed them off, or whether they just ascended, found the rapture, or shot off to a different planet, or all killed themselves in a massive nuclear holocaust. There's stories for every single one, and that means archaeology is embedded in the game setting. Everything about where you are exploring is about history, and I think it does it really well.
Just a short add-on. They reward you with experience for great discoveries. It's like the core system for advancement. It's amazing.
Yeah. You get no experience for killing things. It is always about discovering things.
Excellent. There's some great examples there. I'd just like to wrap this up. Looking at the time, we're just about to come up to an hour. With asking you both 2 recommendations. One of those is a recommendation if somebody is interested in this whole aspect of crossover between folklore or archaeology or a kind of social history and gaming, where a good entry point would be for them. And the other recommendation I'd be interested in hearing is your favorite recommendation for a game that explores those themes. Tom, you can go first.
Both of the games were already named, and they are on the top of my most favorite list. First one, Wesen. It delves a lot into the folklore side of mythology. It's heavy with beautiful creatures and interesting people. And what we didn't talk about is it's set in the mythical north, like Victorian age Scandinavia, but you can twist it a little bit. So if you need a typewriter or some kind of camera, you might find an explanation why it's already there. But they pick up a lot of the social issues during this time too, and make it a point that this is important for the game world you're in. And by this, you do have the historical part, and you do have the very, very intimate story about your investigators. You're getting into a lonely, faraway place and are exposed to a probably hostile population of people and their secrets and all their tiny rituals they're doing. And you have to make the call how to engage with the Wesen. So that's pretty good, and it's a really good entry point, because the DM section gives you a lot of advice how to run a mystery, and gives you very helpful examples and tools as a DM. I had a first-time DM telling me they did a really great job with all the advice and the tools. It's especially the tools that the game gives them to engage this in this kind of story. Yeah, and if you want to go into folklore with a twist and very big emotions and tragic stories and struggle, then go for Changeling. It's a beautiful game, and it's I think I found it 2010, and it took me into all the things I love, like fairy tales and the dark side of them, and all these moments when we are feeling lost and helpless, and all the strategies and people who will help us in these moments, and discovering a place for ourselves to live. And it's beautiful.
Yeah, I've having listened to Changeling campaigns that you've run for Red Moon role playing, for example. Emotion and tragedy are certainly high up on that, but they do make for a really great story. It's true. Matthew.
So just to echo Tom, I won't copy his answers, whether they're very good ones. Changing the Lost was the very first game I saw played where the players were all in tears. Don't know whether that's a selling point or not. For some people, it might be, but it was just probably about 2008, 2009 when I first saw a group playing it who were just all crying because of the thing, not because their characters were being brutalized, but because the revelations their characters were making, or the players were making about their characters, which is a rare amount of emotional investment for any story, let alone a tabletop role-playing game. So it can hit you right in the feels, as they say. But I would recommend people check out the second edition of Changing the Lost. It is very tight. It's an excellent game. So from the archaeological perspective, and you know what, I won't recommend games that I've worked on. How about that? So from the archaeological perspective, I've just realized I've narrowed my field a great deal. Why did I do this to myself?
It's fine. We're not trying to sell things here. You go for your own if you want to. It's perfectly fine.
Numenera it was a perfect pick.
Yeah, Numenera. I've not worked on Numenera. Numenera is a really brilliant archaeological game because not only is it a fantasy game with all the trappings of D&D or Pathfinder or your typical medieval fantasy romp, it has the depth of setting that some people might criticize because they'll say the setting isn't there, it's just paper thin. No, the hooks are there. It's up to the person running it to build that paper into something more substantive. It's a setting all about essentially you can see that that's an earthen mound. You can see that those are strip lynchets. You can see whatever archaeological evidence of a previous civilization you like, but what's underneath them is down to the person running it to come up with. And there's these brilliant ideas just scattered throughout the book for what you can turn this swamp, this jungle, this tomb, this thing that's only just this edifice that's only just been revealed after thousands of years under the sand, what these things can be. So from an archaeological perspective, I hugely recommend Numenera. From a folklore perspective, and especially folk horror, I'm going to cheat and recommend two. And I'll recommend two because one of them isn't out yet. And that one is Solemn Veil. Solemn Veil is, by its headline, a folk horror role-playing game set, as a general rule, in the deep west country of the United Kingdom, Cornwall, Devon, and maybe a little bit of Somerset if you're feeling generous. And it has the sense of paranoia and encroaching dread that so much of the folklore of the decent Hammer House of Horror episodes and the M.R. James short stories, the Christmas ghost stories, for any British people listening, probably familiar with, they all tend to be based around that area when M.R. James isn't set somewhere in Denmark. And it really evokes everything you could want in either a one-shot or a few sessions worth of gameplay of that mounting, cloying, local fear that everyone around you knows something more than you do, and you have misstepped, and now you're going to pay the consequences for that. And that, I think, is just a wonderful horror story to tell. You can go in so many directions with it. And the other one, I would say, again, something that I've worked on and that you can buy already, because Solemn Veil will be out later this year, is probably going to be, I'll go for Vampire the Dark Ages, because as we were discussing it, it was becoming more apparent to me how rooted in folklore the Dark Ages era for Vampire is than the modern era. Modern era where it takes from modern movies, but as we all know, Dracula is, or Vlad Dracul, if you like, is an historic figure, and a lot of the mythology that surrounds him is based on the things that he did. He spawned folklore, and all of the various misdeeds associated with him spawned their own folklore that ends up being condensed into Bram Stoker's fiction and then expanded into a huge raft of movies, TV series, role-playing games, video games, and other media. So Vampire the Dark Ages is wonderful because it allows you to play a predatory monster so you can feel like you've got power. You're not just a peasant, you're not just a sharecropper, you're not just a yeoman, but you still have something to fear because the world is largely unexplored as far as you're concerned. Everyone is very present and local. You have your own little fiefdom, and you have to be damn desperate to want to leave it because you don't know what's out there in the dark. And to play a game where vampires are afraid of the dark, I think is a nice way of really making Vampire into a horror game. So, yeah, those are my two picks. Three picks.
You're allowed three. That's fine. There are some great recommendations there as well. I think something that sprang to mind actually while you were both talking about Changeling and this emotional aspect to it. And I think the fact that the players invest so much in the story. When you look at it in terms of folklore, I think the whole idea of fairies and the fairy folklore is probably that aspect of folklore that actually people have the most emotional investment in, even in modern times. The scale of engagement with that topic, and in many places, Iceland and Ireland particularly, the level of belief that still exists, the fact that roads are diverted even now to avoid going through fairy mounds, for example, maybe that plays into it as well. And this kind of idea of the folk memory and collective consciousness that we all have as human beings even moves across into terms of gaming there. And that's why that kind of emotional investment is so great. It's interesting. One other thing that I think I'm going to throw in as well as a recommendation, which is one that we played on the podcast as well, is, and very similar to Solemn Veil, in fact, is Shivering Circle, which is not a well-known game particularly, written by Howard David Ingham and available through Drive-Thru RPG for pay what you want. But again, it wraps all of this up. It's set amongst a village dynamic that's very much like Solemn Veil. It's set around this idea of a stone circle and the investigative aspect of that. Very, very mechanic light. So focuses very heavily on the storytelling and is dead easy to get into for anybody who first wants to play. So I'm going to throw that in as an extra bonus recommendation from me as well. And then we will leave it, I think. Matthew, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us. Tom, you want to throw in another point?
Yes. I just want to send a short PSA, because we are talking about high emotional stakes and horror, especially. If you play horror, if you play Changeling, please take care about the people you're playing with. Bring game safety in to your table and make sure everybody is fine. Yes, that's very important.
Yep, you wouldn't go and see a movie if you know that it's going to contain something that would appall you. And indeed, if you are in a movie and it does appall you, you have every right to walk out without being judged. Therefore, if playing a game and you find it's too much, then have the exact same boundaries discussed with the group in advance. Talk about what you like, what you don't like, what you want to cover, what you don't want to cover. And if it ever gets too much, call a halt. And that's absolutely fine. These narrative explorations can be quite intense, and especially in horror games. So there's nothing wrong with playing responsibly.
Very, very wise advice from both of you. Thank you. And thank you both for taking the time to come and talk about what is a fascinating subject. Thank you both.
My pleasure.
Too. And thank you.